Imagine looking up and seeing the sky on fire, not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually burning. The atmosphere itself igniting as objects from space tore through it, at velocities that turned air into plasma. That is what happened approximately 12,800 years ago, according to a theory that is moved from fringe speculation to serious scientific consideration, as evidence continues to accumulate in layers of ancient Earth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck Earth across the northern hemisphere in a series of devastating impacts. Not one massive collision, but multiple strikes, a cosmic shotgun blast that hit ice sheets, oceans, and land across a span of hours or days. The friction of these objects entering the atmosphere would have created thermal radiation intense enough to ignite forests across entire continents. The shockwaves would have circled the globe, and the immediate aftermath would have been darkness as dust and debris rose into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging temperatures within weeks or even days. This isn't science fiction. There is physical evidence embedded in the geological record. Researchers have found a platinum anomaly in sediment layers worldwide, all dating to this exact period. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but abundant in asteroids and comets. Its presence in concentrations far above background levels suggests extraterrestrial material scattered across the planet. Alongside the platinum are nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind generated by cosmic impacts. Magnetic spherules appear in the same layers, tiny balls of melted and solidified material consistent with impact events. Then there is the black mat, a layer of sediment found across North America, containing massive concentrations of carbon and soot, evidence of wildfires on a continental scale. Not isolated burns, but synchronized destruction, forests and grasslands, burning simultaneously across thousands of miles. The layer appears suddenly in the geological record, a dark line separating what came before from what came after. What came after was extinction. North American megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, American lions, camels, and dozens of other species, vanished within what appears to be a geological instant. Mainstream science attributes this to gradual climate change and human overhunting. But the timeline is remarkably abrupt. Animals that had survived previous climate fluctuations, that had coexisted with human hunters for thousands of years, suddenly disappeared in synchrony with this cosmic bombardment. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet, researchers have identified the Hiawatha crater, a massive impact structure, approximately 30 kilometers across, dated to roughly the right period. Similar potential impact sites have been identified in the Great Lakes region. The evidence builds layer by layer, paper by paper, discovery by discovery, shifting the hypothesis from controversial to plausible to increasingly probable. For human populations, the effects would have been immediate and catastrophic. Coastal civilizations would have faced tsunamis generated by ocean impacts, walls of water, hundreds of feet high, obliterating everything in their path. Inland populations would have experienced the thermal pulse, the shock waves, and then the onset of rapid climate collapse as temperatures plummeted. Food sources would have vanished within seasons, megafauna dying from the environmental shock, plant life struggling to survive under darkened skies, agricultural systems collapsing as growing seasons shortened or disappeared entirely. The Clovis culture offers a haunting example. These were sophisticated Paleolithic people who dominated North America, distinguished by their advanced stone tool technology and widespread presence across the continent. Around 12,800 years ago, they vanished. Sites that show continuous Clovis occupation suddenly stop. The distinctive tools disappear from the archaeological record. What follows is a period of disruption, of different, less sophisticated technologies, of populations apparently scattered and diminished. This is what extinction looks like in the archaeological record. Not dramatic scenes of final battles or last stands, but simply absence where there was once presence, silence where there was once activity, an empty chapter where the story should have continued. In the span of a single generation, the world didn't just change, it ended, and from its ashes crawled the survivors we call our ancestors, carrying what fragments they could preserve into a future that would remember the catastrophe only as myth. But what if the sky falling was only the beginning? What if the impacts triggered a cascade of secondary catastrophes, each one amplifying the destruction until the planet itself became a hostile, Alien place where survival was measured not in years but in days. Consider the Earth not as a solid sphere, but as it actually is. A thin crust floating on a molten interior. Tectonic plates in constant slow motion. A delicate balance maintained by forces we're only beginning to understand. Charles Hapgood proposed that this crust could, under certain conditions, slide rapidly over the interior, displacing continents by thousands of miles in a matter of years or even days. This isn't T-magnetic pole reversal, which happens regularly and is well documented. This isn't T-continental drift, which moves landmasses at the pace of growing fingernails. This is rapid crustal displacement, a wholesale repositioning of the planet's surface. Albert Einstein found the theory compelling enough to write the foreword to Hapgood's book, Earth's Shifting Crust, lending his considerable reputation to an idea mainstream geology rejected. The evidence Hapgood pointed to remains puzzling. Tropical plant fossils in Antarctica, suggesting that frozen continent was once positioned in temperate latitudes. Sudden climate shifts in various regions that seem too rapid for conventional explanations. And ancient structures whose astronomical alignments no longer match the celestial positions they were designed to track. Then there is the sun itself. Our star is not the stable, benign presence we imagine, but a variable reactor capable of violent outbursts. Coronal mass ejections and solar flares of unprecedented magnitude could strip away portions of Earth's atmosphere, generate electromagnetic pulses that disrupt everything from the planet's magnetic field to the electrical processes in living cells, and trigger climate changes through mechanisms we're only now beginning to study. Ice cores from the Younger Dryas period show unusual isotopic signatures that some researchers interpret as evidence of solar bombardment, cosmic radiation reaching Earth's surface in concentrations that should have been blocked by a healthy atmosphere. Lake Agassiz covered much of central North America during the Ice Age, held back by walls of ice that contained more water than all of Earth's current lakes combined. When those ice dams failed, the release would have been catastrophic. Water equivalent to the Mediterranean Sea, pouring into the oceans within weeks, raising global sea levels by meters, disrupting ocean currents, flooding coastlines worldwide. And Lake Agassiz wasn't alone. Similar glacial lakes existed across the northern hemisphere. Each one a catastrophe, waiting for the moment when ice could no longer contain the pressure. Volcanic activity adds another layer to this apocalyptic scenario. The Toba super eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, ejected more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, triggering a volcanic winter that lasted years and may have reduced human populations to as few as 10,000 individuals worldwide. During the Younger Dryas, increased volcanic activity appears in the geological record, whether triggered by crustal instability from impacts, by rapid climate change affecting tectonic stresses, or by some combination of factors. The result would have been ash clouds, acid rain, further cooling, and continued agricultural collapse. The terrifying possibility isn't that any one of these catastrophes occurred, but that they occurred together, each one triggering or amplifying the others. Cosmic impacts destabilizing the crustal movement, triggering volcanic eruptions, eruptions combining with impact debris to block sunlight, solar activity stripping atmospheric protection, ice dams failing under the stress of rapid geological change, floods disrupting ocean currents and triggering further climate chaos. Not one catastrophe but a symphony of destruction, each instrument playing its part in transforming Earth from a habitable world into a survival nightmare. For populations trying to endure this cascade, there would have been no safe place, no refuge that remained stable, no adaptation that worked for long because the conditions kept changing. What worked in the immediate aftermath of impact wouldn't work during the volcanic winter. What worked during the winter would work when the floods came. What worked when the floods receded wouldn't work if the crust shifted and familiar territories found themselves in new climate zones. This is how civilizations end completely. This is how knowledge gets lost so thoroughly that its existence becomes disputed. This is how the world forgets. But somehow, impossibly, people survived. Genetic evidence tells a story more dramatic than any myth. Analysis of human DNA suggests that around 12,000 years ago, our species experienced a population bottleneck, a crash so severe that all modern humans may descend from as few as 10,000 individuals. 10,000 people on the entire planet. The math is sobering. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, carries genetic markers, tracing back to this tiny remnant population that endured when everyone else perished. Think about what survival would have meant under those conditions. When the sky burned and the earth shook, when darkness fell and stayed for months or years, when temperatures plummeted and food sources vanished, the survivors weren't necessarily the most advanced or sophisticated. They were the fortunate. Those in the right locations, high enough to escape the floods, far enough from impact zones to avoid immediate destruction, positioned where some ecosystem remained viable when most others collapsed. Those with wilderness skills that mattered more than astronomical knowledge when every day was a struggle to find food and shelter. Those inland and elevated while coastal populations, possibly including the most advanced centers of pre-flood civilization, drowned beneath tsunamis and rising seas. There is a cruel irony in that pattern. The cities with sophisticated infrastructure, the coastal settlements with trade networks and specialized knowledge, the places where civilization flourished, these were precisely the locations most vulnerable to water-based catastrophe. Meanwhile, small groups living in mountains, in caves, in regions we might have considered primitive, had the geographical advantage that determined survival. The meek, in a very literal sense, inherited the earth simply by being in places the catastrophe could immediately reach. But survival alone doesn't preserve civilization. Knowledge is fragile, in ways stone and metal are not. When populations crash, when specialists die without transmitting their expertise, when survival becomes so desperate that abstract learning seems irrelevant to the immediate need for food and warmth. Cultural amnesia happens quickly. Within a generation, you lose the details. Within 2 or 3, you lose the technical knowledge. Within 10, you are left with stories that may or may not accurately reflect what was lost. Yet fragments persisted, oral traditions encoded in myths and legends, knowledge too important to forget passed from survivor to survivor, from parent to child, through decades and centuries until the world stabilized enough that writing could preserve it more permanently. The flood myths we discussed earlier, over 200 cultures preserving remarkably consistent accounts. These are what remained when everything else was lost. Not technical manuals but cautionary tales, not histories but mythologies, not facts but truths wrapped in narrative that could survive when paper and stone could not. Some survivors may have carried more than stories. The 7 sages of Sumerian mythology who brought civilization to humanity after a great flood. The Viracocha of South American legend who appeared after cataclysm to teach agriculture and astronomy. The Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, described as preserving ancient wisdom through periods of chaos. These figures appear across cultures as civilizing heroes, teachers who possessed knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, who understood principles that local populations had to be taught, rather than discovering independently. What if these weren't gods or mythological inventions, but actual survivors from more advanced pre-flood societies, small groups who preserved fragments of astronomical knowledge, agricultural techniques, architectural principles, mathematical understanding, who emerged from their refuges after generations to find the world transformed and populated by peoples who had lost or never possessed such knowledge, who became teachers and were remembered as something more than human, because their capabilities seemed superhuman in comparison to those who had survived through luck rather than sophistication. The sudden appearance of advanced civilizations around 3000 BCE, Sumer with its writing and mathematics, Egypt with its architecture and astronomy, the Indus Valley with its urban planning, might not represent humanity inventing civilization for the first time. It might represent humanity recovering civilization, reaching sufficient population and stability to support complex societies again, implementing knowledge preserved through the dark centuries when such knowledge was maintained, but could be fully applied because basic survival consumed all resources and attention. We all descendants of that remnant. Every person reading this, every human alive, carries the legacy of 10,000 survivors who endured the apocalypse. They crawled from caves and ruins carrying memories of a world no one would believe existed, and became the foundation of everything that followed. Around 4000 BCE, something remarkable happened in the flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A civilization appeared that shouldn't have been possible. Not a gradual development from simple villages to complex cities, but a sudden flowering of sophistication that seems to violate everything we think we know about cultural evolution. The Sumerians arrived on the stage of history, already knowing things that supposedly took other cultures millennia to discover. They had writing, not primitive pictographs, but a fully developed system of cuneiform capable of recording everything from poetry to astronomical calculations. They had mathematics based on a sexagesimal system counting in 60s, the same base -60 framework we still use for measuring time and angles 4,000 years later. They had detailed star catalogues tracking celestial movements with precision that required sustained observation across generations. They had sophisticated irrigation networks transforming desert into farmland through engineering principles that shouldn't have existed yet. They had grid, patterned cities with urban planning, demonstrating understanding of geometry and social organization. They had written law codes establishing governance structures of remarkable complexity. The conventional narrative tells us that humans spent hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, then suddenly, within just a few thousand years, invented agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban civilization. The timeline seems almost deliberately compressed, as if history itself is rushing to explain how we got from primitive to advanced without acknowledging what might have existed in between. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. Their texts speak of the Apkal, 7 sage beings who emerged from the sea after a great flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Not humans who invented these arts, but teachers who brought knowledge from somewhere else, from some time before. The Sumerian kings lists record rulers before the flood with rain periods, spanning thousands of years, followed by more realistic lengths afterward. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as mythological exaggeration. But what if they represent something else? Mythologized memory, perhaps, distant recollection of pre-flood times when measurement and record keeping operated differently, or when the concept of rain meant something we no longer understand. Egypt presents a similar puzzle. The civilization appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated, and the Great Pyramid, built supposedly just centuries after Egypt unified, represents engineering and mathematical knowledge that later dynasties demonstrably could not replicate. Egyptian history does show the progressive improvement you expect from a culture learning and developing over time. Instead, it shows a pattern of decline. The earliest monuments demonstrate the greatest precision. The oldest architecture incorporates the most advanced mathematics. Later periods attempt to copy what earlier generations achieved, but fall short, as if working from incomplete instructions for processes they don't fully understand. The Indus Valley civilization emerged around 3300 BCE with urban planning, so sophisticated that cities featured standardized weights and measures, advanced sewage systems, and grid layouts suggesting central planning and mathematical precision. They had metallurgy, they had a written language we still can, they had trade networks extending thousands of miles, and there is minimal evidence of developmental stages, no clear progression from simple to complex. The civilization flourishes for over a millennium, and then declines, leaving behind mysteries we're still trying to solve. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. Advanced capabilities appearing suddenly, fully formed, without the experimental phase that should precede mastery. It is as if these civilizations were working from templates, following patterns established by predecessors, rebuilding according to plans preserved from before. The alternative requires believing in remarkable coincidences, that multiple isolated cultures simultaneously and independently discovered complex mathematics, developed sophisticated astronomy, invented writing systems, and established urban planning principles all within a remarkably compressed timeline. Or perhaps they weren't discovering. Perhaps they were remembering. Perhaps the knowledge came not from gradual invention, but from careful preservation. Fragments passed down from survivors who had seen these principles applied in the world that drowned, who carried forward what they could, and waited for the day when humanity was ready to receive it again. They built perfect cities before they supposedly invented the wheel, unless someone had already shown them how. Knowledge leaves fingerprints. When you find advanced understanding appearing in contexts where it shouldn't exist, where there is no clear path of development leading to it, you are looking at evidence of something that doesn't fit the timeline we constructed. And these fingerprints are everywhere once you know to look for them. Take Egyptian stoneworking. We find evidence of precision drilling in granite and diorite. Stone so hard that modern craftsmen using diamond-tipped tools struggle to match the accuracy. The drill holes are perfectly circular, maintaining consistent diameter through depths of several feet, showing feed rates that would require significant pressure and rotational speed. Yet there is no developmental progression in the archaeological record. No practice pieces, No failed attempts, no gradual improvement from crude to refined, just immediate mastery, appearing as if the techniques were already known, rather than being discovered through experimentation. The Baghdad batteries sit in museums, ceramic jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods that, when filled with acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, generate measurable electrical current. The standard explanation suggests they were used for electroplating gold onto silver. But that explanation requires ancient Mesopotamians to understand electrochemistry millennia before Luigi Galvani supposedly discovered it in 1780. The alternative is that these weren't tea inventions but remnants, copies of technology whose original purpose was forgotten, replicated by people who didn't fully understand what they were reproducing. In the ruins of Nimrud, archaeologists found a piece of worked crystal functioning as a magnifying lens dated to approximately 700 BCE. It is not crude or accidental. It is deliberately shaped, ground and polished with precision that indicates understanding of optical principles. Similar lenses have been found in other ancient contexts where they theoretically shouldn't exist, suggesting knowledge of optics that predates conventional discovery by centuries or millennia. The Antikythera mechanism represents perhaps the most dramatic example of anachronistic sophistication. This device uses differential gearing, a mechanical principle supposedly not reinvented until the medieval period, to track planetary movements and predict eclipses with accuracy, requiring detailed astronomical observations sustained across generations. It is not a primitive attempt at computation. It is a refined instrument demonstrating mastery of both mechanical engineering and mathematical astronomy. Ancient star charts show knowledge of stellar precession, the slow wobble of Earth, S-axis that causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over a cycle lasting 25,920 years. Detecting this phenomenon requires continuous observation across many human lifetimes. Yet monuments built thousands of years ago incorporate compensations for precession into their astronomical alignments, suggesting either impossibly long observation periods or inherited knowledge from predecessors who had already mapped these movements. Medical texts present similar mysteries. The Egyptian Ebers papyrus describes surgical procedures, including brain surgery, with apparent understanding of neurological functions. The Indian Sushruta Samhita details plastic surgery techniques and demonstrates anatomical knowledge that shouldn't have been accessible without systematic dissection. Chinese acupuncture maps show detailed understanding of nervous and circulatory systems that conventional medical history claims was discovered until much later. These aren't lucky guesses, they re-systematic knowledge applied with precision. Navigation presents perhaps the most intriguing anomalies. Polynesians crossed vast Pacific distances using sophisticated understanding of currents, stars, and wave patterns that modern sailors struggled to comprehend even with instruments. Evidence suggests transoceanic contact that supposedly didn't occur. Cocaine and tobacco residue found in Egyptian mummies, despite these plants being native only to the Americas. Artwork depicting species that shouldn't have been known outside their native continents. Genetic markers suggesting population movements that conventional timelines don't accommodate. The pattern becomes undeniable when you examine it comprehensively. In metallurgy, in optics, in astronomy, in medicine, in navigation, in mathematics, across disciplines and across cultures, you find knowledge appearing fully formed, not developing through obvious trial and error, but emerging as if remembered rather than discovered, not progressing from primitive understanding to sophisticated application, but appearing already sophisticated from the earliest examples we can find. Either we re-witnessing the most remarkable series of independent coincidences in history, multiple isolated cultures simultaneously achieving similar breakthroughs without contact or communication, or we re-seeing fragments of a more comprehensive knowledge base that predated all of them, knowledge preserved imperfectly through catastrophe, transmitted incompletely through generations, applied partially by successor cultures that inherited wisdom they could fully replicate, but could sometimes successfully implement. The fingerprints suggest not invention, but inheritance, not discovery, but recovery of what was already known. Knowledge without guardians dies quickly, when civilizations collapse, when populations scatter, when survival consumes all attention. The first casualty is always abstract learning, unless someone deliberately chooses to preserve it. Unless institutions form around the specific purpose of protecting wisdom through the chaos, knowledge vanishes within generations. And throughout history, such institutions have existed. Organizations dedicated to guarding secrets they considered too important or too dangerous for common knowledge. The Egyptian priesthood operated on strict hierarchical principles. Knowledge was parceled out according to rank and initiation. Outer teachings for common priests, inner mysteries for those who proved worthy through years of study and demonstration of character. Temple complexes at Karnak and Dendera functioned not just as places of worship, but as schools where astronomy, geometry, and esoteric principles were transmitted from master to student through carefully controlled processes. The knowledge wasn't written in plain language where anyone could access it. It was encoded in symbols, embedded in rituals, protected by oaths that made revealing sacred teachings to the uninitiated a crime punishable by death. The Library of Alexandria supposedly held over 500,000 scrolls, representing accumulated knowledge from across the ancient world. Texts in dozens of languages, covering everything from mathematics to medicine, astronomy to engineering, philosophy to practical crafts. When it burned, possibly multiple times across different historical periods, the loss was catastrophic. How much understanding disappeared in those flames? How many techniques, how many discoveries, how many preserved records of older civilizations were reduced to ash and scattered smoke? The destruction of knowledge repositories follows a tragic pattern through history. Spanish conquistadors burning Mayan codices, destroying what might have been comprehensive records of astronomical observations and cultural memory, leaving only 4 codices surviving from what was once a vast library of learning. The burning of Nalanda in India, where Buddhist texts and philosophical writings, accumulated over centuries, went up in flames that supposedly burned for months. The loss of countless texts during the fall of Rome, during the Mongol invasions, during the endless succession of wars and religious persecutions that have characterized human history. The Eleusinian mysteries endured for nearly 2,000 years in ancient Greece. Initiates underwent elaborate preparation and ceremony to receive teachings that were never written down, transmitted only through direct experience and sworn to absolute secrecy. We know the mysteries existed. We know they profoundly affected those who experienced them, including many of Greece's greatest philosophers and leaders. But we don't know what they actually taught because the secrecy held. The knowledge died with the last initiated priests, lost when the mysteries were finally suppressed, and the transmission chain was broken. The Pythagorean school operated as both mathematical academy and spiritual society, preserving knowledge of sacred geometry and numerology that members believed revealed fundamental truths about reality itself. They developed or preserved understanding of mathematical relationships, acoustic principles, and geometric patterns that would be fully explored again until the Renaissance. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, through years of study under masters who judged when students were ready for deeper teachings. Some of this ancient wisdom survived through unexpected routes. Islamic scholars translated and preserved Greek and Egyptian texts during Europe's Dark Ages, maintaining knowledge that would have otherwise been lost when Roman civilization collapsed. Byzantine libraries kept classical learning alive when Western Europe descended into centuries of relative ignorance. Esoteric traditions like Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah claimed direct lineage to ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian wisdom, preserving teachings through initiatory systems that paralleled the ancient mystery schools. The question of medieval and Renaissance secret societies remains controversial. Did the Knights Templar discover something during their occupation of Temple Mount in Jerusalem?